This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
Now fall, and the DNA avalanche just continues. It's just so many cases are wrapping up. There's one case that hit the news, and I was absolutely shocked that it hit the news. When it did, it's a French serial killer, and they've now tentatively started linking him in the media, which is sort of odd. But it was this guy they called the Heavy, and he was sort of defined by having scars on his face, like acne scars or pock marks. And this guy, he's been active off and on, but specifically, they were looking at him for these cases. I think they started around 1986. There were some cases I followed a long time ago and just assumed, these are not going to be solved anytime soon, so some kind of DNA hit. But it turns out they've identified a potential suspect, and it's a police officer that they've only identified as Francois. I think they gave his last initial as maybe V or F or something. So this guy was interesting in that I think he's 60 now, so he would have been like really young when he was doing these crimes. But that's sort of an example of something I'd rather see in the news. We were actually talking this week about how jurisdictions work too, and that was a weird one for me because I was so focused in on different stuff related to like Louisiana. I'm really obsessed with this like Clay case right now, and I've kind of got to piecemeal my ideas together so I can look at it and see if I come up with any kind of solution. But the Gabby Petito case brought up some interesting jurisdictional questions. It's relevant to Clay because of Russell Elwood, because he was from Ohio, living in Florida, supposedly committing crimes in Louisiana. The jurisdictional questions that were coming up were related to missing persons cases. Meg's opinion was that it all sort of boils down to money, and that's irrelevant in those cases because it's really just pushing paperwork around. Supposedly in the Gabby Petito case, they tried to report her missing to the local police department there in Northport, Florida. And those people told her, the mom, Gabby Petito's mother, that she had to go find where she was last seen and report her missing there, which when you're traveling like that is really strange to begin with, to try and pinpoint a last location. And I think for me, the solution is just get the FBI involved and see if they'll look at it. That's probably the easiest way, particularly somebody who's been bouncing around the national parks. At least they can put a missing persons report together with the National Park Service. That's my thinking on it. But their point was, we wouldn't have the resources to do anything about a girl who was last seen in Utah or Wyoming or wherever she was last seen. And then other people were posting cases where this one example popped in. A woman who was from California on vacation in D.C. went missing, and the D.C. police wouldn't take the missing persons report. So it's the opposite situation where that person went missing someplace that wasn't their home. They were traveling, and they sent them back and said, well, you need to report her missing locally, which I don't know what that would be. I don't know what the answer to all of that is, but I would have the same suggestion. Get the FBI involved. One of the most fascinating parts about this whole Gabby Petito-Brian Laundrie thing is they have now done with him exactly what they did with Israel Keys. So with Israel Keys, they couldn't get him on anything except for unauthorized access to a financial device, which was a debit card, Samantha Koenig's debit card. That's what they arrested Keys on. That's what they've issued warrants for from the federal grand jury for Brian Laundrie. It looks like something else is happening there because they've started collecting DNA and they've started looking at burner phones and they've started looking at the family more closely. But ultimately, what they did to Brian Laundrie just now is exactly what they did to capture Israel Keys. Interesting tidbit.
You have that DNA avalanche theory where things are going to just slowly start to be solved over the years, and then all of a sudden, everything's going to be solved. It's sort of where we're getting to with it. And we've been talking about this for like 2 years. Even on the podcast, we've been talking about it for like 2 years, that there's going to be this avalanche of cases. While I was looking at like Clay and all these different Louisiana murders, we really want to know who Clay is. And then we really want to know like what happened with a couple of different cases down in Louisiana. But the weirdest news popped up. So this is August 31st that this popped up. By the time people hear this, it's like September. I had never read quite as detailed pieces of this investigation. I've never read anything like it. And when I say quite as detailed, it's because of like what they did to verify it. It was sort of weird. These are some South Florida murders that I have in a pile where I had looked at Miami, I looked at Fort Lauderdale, I looked at a couple different serial killings down there to see if they might be tied to like somebody coming over from Louisiana or Russell Elwood or some of these other things that unfold in Louisiana. Did they spill over into Florida? This had a wrap up like nothing I've ever seen. There's a press conference in here that's it's from the Broward Sheriff's Office, but the headline just reads, "Serial killer in 3 South Florida cold case murders identified." And if you skim through the local news down there, this is what it says. A serial killer responsible for the deaths of 3 women 20 years ago, so in the early 2000s, has been identified. Broward Sheriff Gregory Toney announced Tuesday morning their investigators worked with Miami police investigators to determine that Roberto Wagner Fernandez, a Brazilian national, was their killer. The first woman killed, Kimberly Dietz Livesey, was stuffed into a suitcase and left in Cooper City, Florida, in June of 2000. The second woman, Cia Damas, was put into a duffel bag. She was left along a road in Dania Beach days later. The third woman, she was identified as Jessica Good, and she was killed on August 30th, 2001. Her body had been found floating in the Biscayne Bay. So at the time, suspicion had fallen on Fernandez, who lived in Miami, as a potential suspect after Good's murder, but he fled to Brazil before he could be questioned. The 3 cases shared similar patterns, and detectives from the sheriff's office and Miami police worked together and clues began to emerge. There was DNA evidence collected from all 3 crimes that pointed to one as of yet unknown culprit. Fingerprints collected at 2 of the crime scenes were matched, but the identity of the killer remained a mystery. Unfortunately, traditional methods of submitting that profile and those fingerprints into automated government systems to see if anybody was a match came back with nothing, said Broward Sheriff Detective Zachary Scott. In 2011, Broward Sheriff and Miami police detectives, they got a huge break. DNA from Good's murder matched the unknown suspect in the Broward murders. Additionally, fingerprints taken from Fernandez following the death of his wife years earlier matched the fingerprints from the crime scenes. So that's a 4th murder, or a 4th death. When investigators went to Brazil to attempt to get DNA evidence from Fernandez, they learned that Fernandez left Brazil for Paraguay and reportedly had died in a plane crash there in 2005. But the detectives had questions about whether he had really died in the crash. This case was truly international, and detective, what is his name? I just want to make sure I say the guy's name correctly because he's quoted here. Okay, this is Gregory Toney. So Sheriff Gregory Toney said this case was going to transcend borders and brought in international implications. They worked closely with the Brazilian National Police, which is like their FBI, the U.S. Department of Justice, and our FBI, and in late 2020 and early 2021, Fernandez's grave was dug up and DNA samples were taken. The results matched the profile from the crime scenes of Kimberly, Cia, and Jessica. We were able to confirm ultimately that Mr. Fernandez was deceased. The body was exhumed, DNA was taken, and it all matched his profile, said Miami Police Sergeant Nikolai Trifonov, who was a detective when he worked on Good's case. The former husband of Kimberly, who's Michael Livesey, he had waited 20 years for answers. He said, "My heart goes out to the loved ones of every victim. I hope this gives them a sense of closure, as it does to me." Investigators also revealed during a news conference Tuesday that the victims had substance abuse issues, and part of that addiction involved prostitution and was something that Fernandez frequented. His history in Brazil also had him as a suspect in numerous violent crimes against prostitutes there. Investigators have not closed the book on Fernandez. They believe that he may be responsible for other unsolved murders in South Florida. What did you think of that?
I like it that there's DNA and sort of the way it's all sort of scientific, because otherwise I would have my doubts. And that obviously I can't say like, oh, it's not him, because they've taken the extra distance to go. I don't know. I feel like this guy, I have a feeling he's more of a angry killer.
Yeah, especially when you throw in that, like, there's a spouse in there. That's
it's
kind
weird.
Of strange.
Okay, what I've learned recently in some of the research that I've done is a lot of times what is sort of generally referred to as a woman being a prostitute is actually a woman exchanging sex for drugs.
I want to be really careful with that word, because I think prostitute has a negative connotation to it. So I think that we say they're classified as like sex workers, and that I
don't know that semantics matter so much here.
It does, from the sensitivity of the victims' families, because well,
it said in the article that they had a propensity towards prostitution,
right? And that's a legal word for me. Like, it's a word where you got charged for exchanging sex for money.
Okay, so I am not being disrespectful towards the victims. What I'm saying is I actually feel like they had a friendship. The friendship consisted of they had sex with him and he gave them drugs while they were hanging out. Okay. And to me, that's sort of, it's different.
I see what you're differentiating there. You're saying he's not paying them for sex. He's having sex with them in exchange for having drugs on his person they can share.
Correct.
That's interesting, because we've started to run into a lot more of that.
And so that I don't see that as prostitution. I would discourage any person from, trading their body for anything. But I mean, if that's their prerogative, that's what it is. But when you hear people talk about partying, and it's in the sense that somebody scores the drugs and then, I guess it's an understanding that they're going to use the drugs and, they have sex with the guy. But to me, it's a different type of thing. But it's also more, I think that kind of situation is more where you're going to see anger issues causing deaths.
Yeah, no, I totally put all that together now that you say it that way.
And that's why, so I'm not being disrespectful. I'm saying, it says in the article that they had a propensity towards drugs or substance abuse issues that, but the prostitution that I believe they're referring to is actually more of just a friendly exchange.
Well, it's interesting that you say it that way, because in a lot of courtrooms in the U.S., that it would not, unless there's an established cash value for a
to
fee.
Be at somebody's, domain, wherever they're at, hotel room, house, whatever, and to be hanging out and partying, I wouldn't say that would be like the arrestable offense of prostitution.
It's not that it's not arrestable; it's that it should not be convictable. The idea, I don't know if you remember these old stings, but they would show, I can't remember if it was a television show I was watching that was real or documentary, but they would show like prostitution stings where the woman has, like, they'd only arrest the woman once they've established a price and like a type of service.
And see, that's not what I see happening here.
It's not. You're absolutely right. It's not. This is a very gray area.
I think it would be just as likely if there's several girls there and they're all partying, they may or may not end up having sex with the providers of the drugs.
And that could even be the thing that causes the anger killings in some cases.
I feel like that kind of situation, though, it's volatile. And for one thing, you've got people using drugs. That in and of itself is volatile because it's a clash, for one thing. Some people are happy people when they're on drugs, and then eventually there's a crash after you're coming off of them.
Right.
I could see people lose their temper, and I do think that a lot of times I also wonder like how many overdoses there are and then overreactions to the overdoses.
Right.
And by no means am I trying to lessen it or make it seem like it's okay, because it's not. It's just, I feel like some victims that come out and, you know, they do say, oh, they were sex workers or they were prostitutes. I think they would be really surprised that they had been referred to that.
Yeah, we've come across a couple cases recently where I totally agree that there are a large percentage of women who end up in situations where that's not what was going on in their mind. There are some with pretty clearly delineated, like that's what they do for a living. That's how they put food on their table. But if they were just exchanging in a motel room, you know, sharing some of somebody's drugs and having sex with them, it gets really murky. As far as legally speaking, it gets really murky. So some of these people being called that posthumously, it would be incorrect.
Right, and I think they'd be surprised to even like realize that it could be interpreted that way. I mean, I could be wrong. I feel like the lifestyle that's you sort of end up there. Like what I mean is, you know, you're hanging out with different people, you meet more different people, you're hanging out with those more different people, and you know, things happen. But I think that in the course of that, you know, when something does happen, whether it's somebody ODs, whether it's somebody gets mad and, you know, hits somebody too hard, whether it's somebody gets too rough and, you know, accidentally kills them, or whether somebody's a jerk and kills them on purpose, like, I feel like they would just be really surprised to know that what they were doing was then called, you know, that they were a prostitute and they were they were in the sex trade industry.
Yeah, I could definitely see how. I think that ties into what we look at in a big way from the perspective of once that distinction is made, certain resources, traditionally speaking, have not been applied to those cases. Like once they get the idea that this was not a housewife, this was not a young mother, this was not a teacher, this was not a person with, like, there's something about the distinction of this person was a sex worker, or regardless of how they get there, whether it's money or drugs or whatever, there's something about just saying that it's almost like they get backburnered until it's like multiple instances, and then they're really going after the monster. They're not going after justice for the individual victims like they're supposed to.
Yeah, and I have a hard line on I don't approve. I feel like it's wrong the way that law enforcement in general treats what I call prostitute murders. And I've said, you know, I refer to prostitute murders in a way that that's how I group them together and how law enforcement reacts to them. It doesn't say anything about the victim. But it's a disregarded crime a lot of times. Now, I've recently had several things that I've looked into that have sort of changed my perspective on that. Not completely. It's just, you know, there is some accountability for the victim, like not when they're a victim, but when they're alive and they're living their life. Don't feel like you can just like barrel through life and not suffer any consequences and then expect anything at the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're basically saying that some of the choices in high-risk victims, there are elements of those choices that they're responsible for, and that we have to tiptoe around it with sensitivity to the victim. But the truth is, like, they made some choices along the way somewhere that had those choices not been made, the end might have had a different result.
Right. Or that the same choices being made by anybody else could have just as well landed them there. And
Right.
the fact that they didn't make those choices is why they didn't end up there.
Right.
And I feel like that can, I'm sure it rubs the wrong way. So I guess my point is I've always been very disgusted at law enforcement not solving prostitute murders, what I refer to as prostitute murders. But then I realized that I don't necessarily think even they are attributing it in a way to be disrespectful towards the victim. I think it's just, it can be really hard. Those type of crimes can be really hard to sort of get resolved because a lot of times people don't actually know what happened, even the people who may have witnessed it, because they're not in their right minds or whatever. And then a lot of times people that are in that type of situation, they're not going to talk to the cops even if they know something.
One of the reasons I brought this particular case up being solved, the Brazilian case, as we move into some of this other stuff, is one, Clay flat out says he was killing sex workers. That's one of the things that happens in the Howard Stern phone call that we listened to in previous episodes. The idea there is like they wouldn't be really missed. And one of the pieces of that you brought up to me, I just want to point out, was he said he always made sure they got paid.
He said that he always gave them their money and made sure they kept it.
What does that even mean?
Well, he said with regard to the one that had a penis, he put it in a compromising place. So I would assume, we can all guess where that is. But then I guess with, where can you make sure somebody's going to keep their money, but it not be compromising? And I guess their mouth, I guess.
You know what? I assume that it involves some orifice of some kind. And
when he made that distinction though, because he was unhappy that what he assumed to be a female ended up having a penis. That's what he's saying, right? And because of that, he put the money in a compromising place. So I assumed from that distinction that meant in general he didn't do that. And so then I was like, well, if he put it in a compromising place because he was angry that this person he perceived to be a female was a male, that would mean that typically he would put it in their mouth, I guess. I can't imagine where else he could make sure they kept it.
I assume rectum or mouth. That this gets into terrible territory.
Up until the distinction was made, I assumed the same thing. But once he said that was actually like we're talking about somebody he just hammered to death.
Right.
Okay. So it's not like he's being respectful or having anything good happening there, but he made a very clear distinction that he felt like he did like a little extra effort to be, disrespectful and horrible by putting it up. I assume the guy's rectum. Right. That's what I assume. But that would mean he didn't do it in the other cases.
Right. So that was one of the things that stood out that we talked about. I went about collecting information that I'm still piling through, but the way that I went about this was I started looking for hammer attacks, young white males between late 80s, early 90s, hammer attacks that were unsolved. I looked sort of around the U.S. a little bit. There were a lot more than I realized, and my thinking was if he used that weapon with these women, he might use that weapon in other instances. I really was just trying to get an idea of what type of person we're looking for. And I did come across numerous people involved in hammer attacks and several unsolved hammer attacks. Listening to that call, you felt like it was pretty genuine for a number of reasons. Do you still feel that way now?
Well, I actually listened to it again just a few minutes ago. But yeah, I feel like there was one particular spot where some of the interaction between the caller and Howard Stern and the female co-host, I believe her name was Robin.
It's Robin.
It seemed very genuine. It seemed, and we talked about before, like the guy should win an award if it was a bit, because some of the, and I can't actually think of an example, but some of the exchanges that they had, it was too real to not be real.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. So I brought up the Brazilian guy because that guy would have been killing just after this. I know that sounds like, so the Brazilian guy has the wife murder and some anger murders that occurred in 2000, 2001. This would have been 4 years after this phone call. And here's why. Because I wonder, first of all, I don't think this guy's ever been caught. And people allege that he might be different people. He's not those people from what I can tell. I don't think this guy has ever been caught. And from what I know about Louisiana law enforcement, I don't know that a lot of effort was necessarily put together to look for someone like this. Even if the FBI, did get the recordings like Howard Stern show says, if this guy is real, he may be dead, similar to this guy dying in a plane crash and going to Paraguay. Or he could be in prison on other charges. But I, for a number of reasons, looked into him from the perspective of, like, how did he become who he was? And why did he call the Howard Stern show? Because it's interesting. Howard asked him at one point, like, were you going to the press with this stuff? And I couldn't help, like, the guy's response is actually what made me think that he was totally legit, because he was sort of like, well, yeah. And you and I both agreed that calling the Howard Stern show in 1997 was like, it's the 1997 version of sending a postcard to the newspaper or making phone calls to the local news station.
It was clearly an effort to get press coverage.
Yeah, he was doing it. And I think, so at first I was like, maybe he just stopped killing after that. But then I thought, if he calls the Howard Stern show to get a little attention and they pay no attention to him, and I'm not saying Howard pays no attention to him, but do you think he killed again after that?
Maybe if he got his car working again.
That was the part that was, so, like, you can,
so weird.
You can sort of develop a timeline. That's why I started with the hammer attacks. Something you brought up was, how did he get the name Clay? So,
well, because it rolled right off of his tongue. Like, I mean, he's like, you can call me Clay. He doesn't say my name is Clay. He says, you can call me Clay.
Right. So that's another thing that's on the list for these episodes down in Louisiana is I've started pulling together references to Clay previous to what would be August 1997. Because, there's an off chance that it's something we won't catch related to, like, a family member or something.
I have a feeling that, so I think his last murder is going to be September of 96. So, because he says we're coming up on a year.
Okay.
And that I noticed that when I was listening. And he says that he killed 2 of his victims in a parking garage. He does not mention if he left their bodies there or not.
Right.
He doesn't talk about transporting the bodies. He says that the rest of them were on the side of the road. And he says that, I believe it's in reference to the girl that had a penis, is what he's saying, was one of the bodies found. And so that implies that there were bodies that weren't found. And so he's got 12 victims, with the last kill being coming up on a year. And, thank goodness he didn't have that car. He had car trouble. That's why it had been so long.
Right.
But his first victim being when he was 16. Now, I penned this guy to be 25. And then now I'm sort of like, I think he's between 25 and 35.
And that's as of the recording in 1997.
Correct. But that would have made, so in 1997, let's say he's 25, that would be 9 years earlier is when he would have been 16. And then obviously if he's 35, it'd be 19 years earlier. And so that gives you an idea of like when he started.
Right.
And he says that on one night he killed 2. But he went to Mississippi to get the other one, is what he says. So that to me says that most of his victims are going to be in the Louisiana area.
That is what I was thinking as well.
Because when I started looking, it's because otherwise, why say that at all, right? Like,
right.
You just had 2 victims. Let's see, what else did he mention that is relevant? He did. He strangled 1 victim. The rest of them he hit with a hammer. He said that it only took about 1. I mean, he didn't stop after 1, but it took 1 good hit.
I am digging through different beatings. That's what I'm looking for. Do you think that this guy would have been strangling people? I'm just out of curiosity there.
He said he strangled 1 person. So, I mean, it seems like I feel like it's going to continue. He didn't get anything out of the strangling.
Okay. So, did you get a sense of where you think he's operating in Louisiana?
Around, I would say around New Orleans, but
I looked at New Orleans and I'm looking at Baton Rouge as well. I'm just looking there right now because there's a number of things I want to talk about. We're sort of in the middle of 4 things here with Clay, and
another thing that he mentioned is that he would, I think Howard's like, well, would you tell him you were a killer like before you killed them? Because he's like, have you ever told anybody? He's like, well, I told some of the girls, but they're dead. And he said that, how did he put it? He said, sometimes when you're out in the middle of nowhere, you can play a game of chase or something. So I guess what he meant by that was he would say, oh, by the way, I've killed, 10 prostitutes and you're going to be number 11. And then that would start a pursuit. And since they would be out in the middle of nowhere, and he said there is a lot of out in the middle of nowhere out here.
Yeah.
I don't know how relevant that is to New Orleans. I don't know a whole lot about Louisiana as far as like the geographics of it. I don't know if in some states that I'm familiar with, they could have like what their big city isn't even as big as what a small city is elsewhere. And
right.
So it's, it's a skewed sort of, and it's a little bit subjective depending on your experience. And so I have no idea, but he does reference that, and he says it as if it's happened more than once. So that would involve him being out in the middle of nowhere and a chase ensuing. So whatever you think that like how far out in the middle of nowhere do you have to be before you can chase your 11th murder victim after you've told him you've killed 10 people? I don't know exactly, but that gives you an idea of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. Well, so one of the other things that we're going to do with this particular case is I am trying to, we talked about this. I don't think we talked about this on recording, so I'll talk about it now. I'm trying to figure out how do you get a FOIA on what the FBI did with the Howard Stern phone call. And this is the path that was recommended to me. The idea is that we are going to go looking for the lead sheet. The lead sheet would be what came into them in terms of like how they found out the information. It could be that an FBI employee had it. They would still fill out a lead sheet in this instance. And then we're going to go looking to see if there's any files that sort of surround it. But in general, we want to know if we can sort of see if someone like Clay is still active. And as we progress into the fall, we've got a couple of different types of serial offenders and crimes and things occurring in Louisiana. And then we probably will wrap up the year talking about something that's sort of nationwide, I'm thinking. But we had addressed the idea that we wanted to know if this was Russell Elwood. So I'm just going to cover a long document related to Russell Elwood, and then we're going to talk about that. So we can actually get quite a bit of information from this particular document. And you can find this online. This is the state versus Russell Elwood. It's identified as being part of the Court of Appeal of Louisiana, the Fifth Circuit. And it's number 00, which indicates it was in the year 2000, KA-1232. It was decided on February 28th of 2001. So here's what this document says. Richard Leube is the Attorney General, and James Piker is the Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice Criminal Division in Baton Rouge. For the plaintiff appellee, you have James McPherson from McPherson and Chelsea in New Orleans. The summary of the document is, defendant Russell Elwood was charged by indictment on March 23rd of 1998 with 2 violations of second-degree murder in violation of LSARS 1431. Count 1 charged Elwood with the murder of Dolores Mack, and Count 2 charged Elwood with the murder of Cheryl Lewis. On April 9th of 1998, the defendant was arraigned and entered a plea not guilty on both counts. Approximately 1 year later, on March 2nd, 1999, the state entered a nolle prosequi, dropping the charge as to count 1 of the indictment regarding Dolores Mack. So they're basically letting Russell Elwood off the hook with that one. But the indictment was also amended to allege that Cheryl Lewis was murdered on or between January 31st of 1993 and February 9th of 1993. With his attorney present, the defendant was arraigned on the amended indictment on April the 9th of 1998. At that time, the defendant pled not guilty to the charge of second-degree murder of Cheryl Lewis. That's what it says in the document. Some of these, you're going to hear these dates, and some of them sound like they're out of order. But these dates themselves are straight from the court document. Because of extensive pretrial publicity, the trial court granted the defendant's motion for a change of venue from St. Charles Parish to Lafayette. A 3-day trial began on June 8, 1999, which concluded in a unanimous jury finding that the defendant was guilty as charged. On August 17th of 1999, the defendant was sentenced to life imprisonment at hard labor without the benefit of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. The defendant filed a timely motion for appeal, which was granted by the trial court. So here's the facts of the case. On February the 2nd, 1993, Cheryl Lewis was reported missing by her mother, Lillian Lewis. 3 witnesses testified that they had seen Cheryl Lewis prior to her disappearance, either with or in the proximity of defendant Russell Elwood. On February 21st, 1993, the body of an African-American woman was found off of Highway LA 3160 in Hahnville, Louisiana. The victim had been stripped naked and submerged in a canal off the side of the road. Fingerprints identified the body as that of Cheryl Lewis. An autopsy and toxicological examination led to the conclusion that the victim had drowned. However, she was alive but unconscious when she hit the water. Although toxicology tests revealed the presence of cocaine in the victim's body, the drug was not the cause of death. Additional tests placed the date of death between February 1st and February 3rd of 1993. Almost exactly 1 year after the victim had been reported missing, the defendant was discovered in his car by 2 off-duty St. Charles Parish deputies on the same desolate stretch of road approximately 1 mile from where the victim's body had been discovered. The car was dark, but apparently occupied by a driver. The deputies decided to investigate, and after several attempts, the deputies got the driver, who was partially undressed, to exit the vehicle. The driver produced a valid Louisiana driver's license that identified him as Russell Elwood. Elwood told the deputies that he was there to change the oil and brakes in his car and consented to a search of his vehicle. The deputies, however, did not find motor oil, oil-changing supplies, oil filters, or brake pads in Elwood's vehicle. Elwood's vehicle also did not contain the type of artificial lighting that would have been necessary to make these types of mechanical repairs in an unlit area at night. Subsequently, a serial crime task force was originated to investigate the murders of several prostitutes in the New Orleans area. In May of 1995, while investigating the murder locations of several victims for the task force, Detective Philip Ramone of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office was informed by a St. Charles Parish deputy that a suspicious person identified as Russell Elwood had been stopped in an area of one of the murder sites. Based on the information provided to the task force by the St. Charles Parish Sheriff's Office, the defendant became a suspect in the investigation. On July 23, 1997, Colonel Walter Gorman of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office traveled to Sebring, Florida, with other members of the Serial Crime Task Force for the purpose of conducting interviews with the defendant. The defendant had previously moved to Sebring to develop a relationship with his father. After being advised of his rights, the defendant gave several statements to the police over a period of 3 days. These statements were tape recorded and later transcribed. Now, during the course of the interviews, the defendant admitted to being involved with over 100 prostitutes in his lifetime. The defendant also admitted that he engaged in significant drug use and that he had a propensity for, quote, black females, unquote. On August 4th of 1997, just a few days after the interviews had been concluded, the defendant was arrested for purchasing cocaine from an undercover officer in Sebring, Florida. As a result, he was incarcerated for 85 days. According to testimony offered at trial, the defendant made a number of statements to fellow inmates regarding prostitutes he had killed in Louisiana. One of these inmates, Stan Hill, testified at trial that the defendant had described to him in graphic detail how he would take prostitutes to remote areas, overdose them, choke them, and drag them out of his taxi naked. The defendant admitted to police in a tape statement that he had indeed made the statement to Stan Hill. The defendant was ultimately placed on probation for the Florida cocaine charge, and he moved to Canton, Ohio to work for his brother. The task force conducted a second round of interviews with the defendant in Ohio. Ron Camden, a 27-year veteran of the Cincinnati Police Department Homicide Squad, and someone with whom the defendant referred to as an associate advisor of mine, was also present. At that interview, the defendant initially denied making statements to Stan Hill. However, when Hill's taped statement was played for the defendant said in response to various points of Hill's statement, yep, yes, right. The defendant finally admitted to Camden in a tape statement that he had made the statements to Stan Hill. Ultimately, the defendant confessed to Camden that he had taken a black female, put her in his car, taken her down the road, and put her in the water. The defendant refused to allow this statement to be taped. Later, the defendant denied to Camden that he had made the statement at all. In January of 1998, the defendant voluntarily returned to Louisiana from Ohio and was subsequently arrested for the murders of Dolores Mack and Cheryl Lewis. On appeal, the defendant argues the evidence presented at trial is insufficient to sustain a conviction of second-degree murder because the state failed to prove that Russell Elwood killed Cheryl Lewis. The defendant complains that the state's case was based solely on unreliable circumstantial evidence, as there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. And further, the defendant implies that the credibility of certain witnesses called against them is at issue. In particular, the defendant implies that jailmates and incarcerated former prostitutes and former drug dealers called to testify against them lacked credibility. They go on to analyze this case, and basically what they're doing here is they go through point by point to say how this fits with the statutes of the state of Louisiana and other precedents that are relevant. The gist of it is the defendant being convicted of second-degree murder is essentially affirmed. The way that they break it down it's relatively interesting. So I'm going to read some points for it, but I'm not reading verbatim what's happening here. I'm just sort of going through and hitting the highlights of how they put all this together at the appellate level. So January 31st of 1993 is the last day that Cheryl Lewis, who's a drug user and a known prostitute, is seen alive by her family. At trial, the victim's mother testifies that after Mrs. Lewis had attended the birthday party of her daughter, she reportedly left at 2:30 in the afternoon but failed to return that day. Now, Mrs. Lewis's mother, Lillian Lewis, became alarmed when Cheryl had not returned by February the 1st of 1993, and she made an unsuccessful attempt to locate her. On February the 2nd of 1993, Lillian Lewis filed a missing persons report for her daughter. She testified that Cheryl Lewis did unpleasant things to obtain drugs. And that's, quote, unpleasant things. However, Miss Lewis was concerned for her daughter's safety because Cheryl had left behind an uncashed monthly SSI check when she disappeared. On cross-examination, Lillian Lewis testified at trial that she had never seen Russell Elwood with her daughter. At the trial, 3 witnesses testified that they had seen the defendant either with Cheryl Lewis or in the area near Cheryl Lewis prior to her disappearance. Denise Sanders is a lifelong acquaintance of Miss Lewis, and Miss Sanders, she resided in the Bridge City area at the time of Lewis's disappearance and testified that she saw Lewis 3 days prior to the time she was reported missing. Cheryl Lewis had asked Sanders at that meeting if she could hustle with her, which the term hustling here means could she help her sell drugs. When Sanders refused this request, Lewis then indicated to Sanders that she wished to obtain drugs for herself. When she says hustle, she means like, can they figure out some kind of buy-sell deal on drugs? That's what's happening. The court references it in parenthetical expressions as selling drugs. So basically, Cheryl is asking Denise to sell her drugs. Ms. Sanders instructs Cheryl to go to the convenience store to buy a pack of cigarettes while she went to get the drugs. And Sanders testifies that as she crossed the highway, she heard a car horn sound and saw the defendant pass in his car. Sanders said she withheld this information from police at the time because she was a drug dealer. The second witness who places Cheryl Lewis with the defendant prior to the disappearance was Antoinette Holmes. Holmes testified that she had known Cheryl Lewis from being in the neighborhood from where she had married. Holmes last saw Lewis at a time saver by the Huey P. Long Bridge, which is in Bridge City, 2 weeks before she was reported missing. Lewis was standing between 2 parked cars having a conversation with one of the drivers in the cars. Holmes recognized one of the car's occupants as a gentleman that frequently came through this area known for drugs to get drugs and look for a lady to do the drugs with, a prostitute. And in quotes, it has Holmes saying, with a prostitute so far, and that I've actually done drugs with myself. So she's saying she's done drugs with him before. In the photographic lineup, Holmes picks out the defendant as the man to whom Lewis was speaking at the time, and also as a man that she had, quote, gotten loaded with before. Guinevere Henry was Cheryl Lewis's cousin-in-law and also knew Lewis from the street. The last time that she saw Cheryl Lewis was at a hotel off of Highway 90 in Avondale, Louisiana. At the time, Lewis was with a man that Henry identified from a photo lineup as the defendant. So all of these instances referencing the defendant here, they're all referencing Russell Elwood. Lewis had indicated to Henry that she and the defendant were headed down the road to another town and asked Henry if she wanted to go with them. This was the same general area where this other town was the same general area where the victim's body was ultimately found. Henry had declined the invitation. She testified that she did not come forward with this information because she was running from a warrant at the time. At trial, in response to the alleged sightings of the victim and defendant together, the defendant testified that he didn't know Cheryl Lewis. On February 21st, 1993, Deputy Darwin Grabbert was working in the crime scene division of the St. Charles Sheriff's Office, where his duty included securing photographs, evidence, and fingerprints. On the morning of February 21st of 1993, at approximately 8:28 a.m., Grabbert acted in his capacity as a crime scene technician by traveling to an area located on Louisiana 3160 in Hahnville, Louisiana. He describes this area as devoid of homes and street lighting. When Grabbert arrived on the scene, he observed some police units and the marking of a body. He proceeded to the area and he took his camera out in an effort to search for evidence at the scene. The deputy testified that he did not find anything evidence-wise in the immediate area. The body of the victim was in the canal lying face down, a short distance from the canal bank. Once the body of the victim was pulled from the water, it was determined that the victim was a female. The victim was nude except for a pair of socks. The deputy testified that there were no means of transportation in the area that suggested how the body got there. At the crime scene, Grabbert secured skin from the victim's right hand and had it processed for fingerprints. The victim was subsequently identified as Cheryl Lewis. On February 22, 1993, Dr. Susan Garcia, a forensic pathologist employed by the Jefferson Parish Coroner's Office, performed the autopsy on Cheryl. She testified that the decedent was found in a moderate to slightly advanced stage of decomposition. She was floating nude and face down in the water, which indicated that the victim had died an unnatural death. Dr. Garcia examined the victim for obvious causes of death, such as gunshot wounds, blunt trauma, or stabbing, but didn't find any. In an internal examination of the victim, Dr. Garcia found no evidence that the victim had been strangled or that something had been put around her neck. Dr. Garcia left the cause and manner of death undetermined, pending further tests on her part and the toxicological examination of fluids that were taken at the time of the autopsy. After all the test results were received, Dr. Garcia concluded that the victim was alive but unconscious at the time she was put into the water, and that the immediate cause of death was drowning. The formal conclusion of Garcia's report was that the victim had died of asphyxia due to drowning. Dr. Garcia also concluded from the toxicological examination that the decedent had tested positive for cocaine and had had a cross-reaction with amphetamines. However, Dr. Garcia testified that she was certain beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim's death was not the result of a cocaine overdose. She reiterated her expert opinion that the victim was alive but unconscious when she hit the water. On cross-examination, Dr. Garcia testified she was not able to estimate the date of the victim's death and gave a range from between a week prior to her discovery to upwards of 1 month or so. However, as she considered Dr. William Bass, a PhD, a forensic anthropologist, to be one of the nation's foremost authorities in that area, she had recommended to the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office that Dr. Bass be associated with the case to help to determine the date of death. At trial, after an examination by both the state and the defendant, the court qualified Dr. Bass as an expert in the field of forensic anthropology. Dr. Bass stated that in January of 1998, he was contacted by Lieutenant Steve Burris of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office regarding the Cheryl Lewis case. After an initial contact was made, the lieutenant brought crime scene photos, an autopsy report, and a temperature reading from the general area where the victim was found to Dr. Bass in Knoxville, Tennessee. Based upon crime scene photographs, Dr. Garcia's autopsy report, and forensic methodology, Dr. Bass concluded that the victim had been deceased for 18 to 20 days at the time that her body was discovered. This would have placed the date of the murder between February 1st of 1993 and February 3rd of 1993. The defendant had testified at trial that he was in New Orleans between January 31st and February the 9th of 1993. Almost exactly 1 year after she'd been reported missing, Boyd Fricke, a patrol sergeant with the St. Charles Parish office, was driving down the same desolate stretch of highway where Cheryl Lewis's body had ultimately been discovered. Fricke was off duty at the time, having just completed a paid security detail with Officer David Chason. Both officers testified at trial, and according to their testimony, they were on their way home when they passed a cab on the side of the road, which was occupied by a driver. The car was parked 1 mile from where Cheryl Lewis's body had been discovered, and Fricke and Chason decided to investigate. After several attempts to get the driver to exit the vehicle using the patrol car's PA system, the officers were finally successful. The driver appeared to be partially undressed as he left the vehicle. He produced a valid Louisiana driver's license, which identified him as Russell Elwood. Now, Elwood told Fricke that he was there to change the oil and brake fluid in his cab. With Elwood's consent, Fricke and Chason searched Elwood's cab, but Fricke did not find any supplies in the trunk. A search of the interior of the cab revealed a brown medicine bottle, a spoon, and some tools on the floorboard. Elwood was not issued a citation as a result of this stop. However, Sergeant Fricke filled out a field interview card to document the incident, and Officer Chason took picture of Elwood's vehicles to document the contents. The pictures showed that Elwood's trunk did not contain motor oil, oil changing supplies, oil filters, or brake pads. Elwood's cab also did not contain artificial lighting, which would have allowed one to make those types of mechanical repairs at night or in low light. In May of 1995, at the behest of the FBI, a serial crime task force was formed to investigate a series of murders of African-American drug-using prostitutes that had occurred between 1991 and 1995. The focus of the task force was a 60-mile radius that included 5 parishes. Detective Philip Raymond of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office was assigned to the task force between May of 1995 and March of 1998. At trial, Raymond testified that he traveled to each of the murder sites subject to the task force investigation for the purpose of obtaining global positioning system coordinates, or GPS coordinates. While at one of the sites, a St. Charles Parish officer stopped Raymond to ask what he was doing. When he explained his purpose for being there, the officer remarked that a suspicious person had been discovered there and informed Ramon of the incident involving Russell Elwood. Consequently, Elwood became a suspect in this investigation. Another member of the task force, Walter Gorman, of the Criminal Investigations Division and Crimes Against Persons sections, testified at trial. He stated that on July 23, 1997, he traveled to Sebring, Florida, in order to approach the defendant for the first time in reference to the investigation, based on information that was developed by members of the task force. He was accompanied by Detective Murray from the Sebring, Florida Police Department. At 8 o'clock a.m., Gorman and Murray go to Elwood's apartment. Gorman advises the defendant that he was with the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office and that he was in Sebring, Florida, investigating a series of homicides that occurred in Louisiana. In Gorman's opinion, the defendant was not surprised by the visit. In fact, Sergeant Olga Fourreau of the St. Charles Parish Sheriff's Office, who was also present, testified that the defendant told her he dreamt the police were coming to get him because of the serial murders. The defendant picked up several items he wanted to take with him to the interview and accompanied Gorman, without protest, to the Highland County Sheriff's Office in Florida. After being advised of his rights, the defendant gave several statements to police over a period of days. These statements were tape-recorded and transcribed. Gorman asked the defendant whether he'd ever been in the area where the bodies, subject to the task force investigation, were dumped. Defendant's answer was, "I realized I'd actually been sleeping in my taxi cab in the exact areas of the body dumping ground of the killer, especially on the I-55 by the boat launch." Gorman asked the defendant if he interacted in any form or fashion with prostitutes, and the defendant indicated he did not want prostitutes in his cabs. After the defendant made the statement regarding prostitutes, however, he made an admission to Gorman that he had in fact been involved personally with a number of prostitutes. The defendant told Gorman that in regard to the number of prostitutes he'd been with, "I'd say it's over 100 my entire life." The defendant had admitted to Gorman that he engaged in cocaine use, crack use, LSD use, and IV drugs as well, but he denied that he was presently doing any drugs. He also admitted to Gorman that he had a propensity for black females. Gorman testified that at one point in the interview, the defendant indicated to Lieutenant Sue Rushing that he felt he could not leave. In response to this, Gorman led the defendant out of the police station and said, "You can go. I don't want you to feel like you can't go. There's the outside. You are now outside. Go." Minutes later, the defendant walked back into the police station and said, "I don't know about the rest of y'all, but I'm going back in." Over the course of the 3-day interview, the defendant met with Lieutenant Stacy Phillips of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, and Lieutenant Phillips asked the defendant specific questions regarding the deaths of Cheryl Lewis and other victims whose murders were being investigated by the task force. The defendant denied any involvement in those murders. On August the 4th, 1997, just a few days after the interviews had been concluded, the defendant was arrested for purchasing cocaine from an undercover Highland County Sheriff's deputy. As a result, he was incarcerated for 85 days. While incarcerated, the defendant made a total of 21 requests to speak with Detective Sharon Glisson of the Highland County Sheriff's Office. Glisson had been tangentially involved in the interviews conducted with the defendant a few weeks prior, but had not personally conducted any of the interviews herself. Glisson testified that she had responded to the defendant's request for a meeting and saw the defendant on August 11, 1997. At the time, she advised the defendant of his rights, and the defendant told Glisson that he gave untruthful answers in his interview with Lieutenant Stacy Phillips. During the time of his incarceration, the defendant also allegedly made certain statements to fellow inmates who testified at trial. Charles Stewart first came into contact with the defendant in a correctional facility in Kansas while both were incarcerated there. Stewart testified that the defendant told them that he was a suspect in a murder, but that they wouldn't be able to convict him on any but 3. During a fight between the defendant and another inmate, Stewart testified he heard the defendant say, "I'll kill you, just like I did them other N-words." Regarding the defendant's attitude towards prostitutes, Stewart testified the defendant told him every dead crack whore was a good start. And finally, Stewart testified that the defendant told him he was out with a prostitute shooting dope, and I guess she wigged out and he left, and the girl ended up dead. Layman Ray Jr. was incarcerated with the defendant at Highland County Correctional Facility. Ray testified at trial that the defendant told him while in jail that he was accused of murders in Louisiana. The defendant also reportedly told him that if they convicted him on any, it would be like 3. When asked at trial if the defendant had provided any details regarding any of the murders, Mr. Ray testified, "He told me he was doing drugs with this black girl. When he was driving a taxi, he had drove to a waterfront area under a bridge embankment there close to the water, and that he had killed one there." Ray further testified that he overheard another inmate ask the defendant why he killed the girl immediately thereafter during a fight with the same inmate who asked the question. He heard the defendant say, "Yeah, I killed that N-word, that bitch, and I'll kill you too." Stan Hill was incarcerated with the defendant at the Highland County Correctional Facility in Sebring, Florida. Hill testified at trial that the defendant had told him about selling cocaine, being a taxi driver, and giving prostitutes rides in his taxi cab, where he would inject them with a heroin and cocaine mix. When asked if the defendant explained why he did this, Mr. Hill stated that the defendant said that he would assist the victim in administering the drugs. Then he would take the victim out to a secluded area, park the cab, and get into the back seat. He would inject the victim with more drugs, and if the defendant did not overdose, he would choke her until he was certain she was dead. The defendant also stated he would then sexually assault the victim and discard the body before leaving the scene. Stephen Michael Bussieri was incarcerated with the defendant at the Highland County Correctional Center in Sebring, Florida in July of 1997. Bussieri testified that the defendant claimed that he was wanted for approximately the deaths of 60 people in Louisiana. When pressed for details about one of the incidents, Bussieri encountered a similar factual scenario as that presented by Hill. However, his account was specific to one incident which involved a petite, short-haired black female. Further, the defendant described the incident as occurring on a long, narrow 2-lane road with a body of water on one side or the other, or maybe on both sides. Bussieri also testified that one afternoon he observed the defendant who was laying down in his cell saying, "I'm guilty, I'm guilty, I'm guilty, but through the Lord Jesus Christ, I will be innocent." When he asked the defendant what he was referring to, the defendant indicated he was talking about murders for which he was wanted in the state of Louisiana. Finally, Bussieri testified that the defendant told him that the people he was killing weren't people. They were nothing but prostitutes. Diane Gilliam, a former prostitute, testified she knew the defendant from her days soliciting sex on Airline Highway. She was able to point out the defendant at trial and testified that she met Elwood when he picked her up at the London Lodge Motel on Airline Highway. Gilliam testified that she told the defendant that if he waited until after her date with a client, the two of them could go get a hotel room, get high, and party. The two of them went to purchase drugs, and on the way back to the hotel room, the defendant turned off the road, presumably to do a puff of cocaine off of a pipe. Gilliam said the defendant stopped the car, at which time he began severely beating me and tearing up my clothes and strangling me. When the victim was unable to breathe, the defendant hit her in the head with a knife that was on the floor, and she passed out. Gilliam testified that when she awoke, she was in a pool of blood in a wooded, unfamiliar area, transported by a passing motorist to the London Lodge Motel on Airline Highway. Gilliam did not report the incident to the police because she felt no one would believe her since she was a prostitute. The incident with this defendant occurred 7 years prior to trial. Nawasa Richmond testified at trial that she had 2 encounters with the defendant. Richmond testified that the first time she met the defendant, she was a stripper and also a prostitute on the side. Richmond was on her way to a prostitution date on the Airline Highway when the defendant pulled her over and asked if she needed a ride. Richmond stated that she recognized the defendant from a place she used to work some years before. Richmond testified she told the defendant if he waited on a date, they could get a room together and buy some drugs. When Richmond came out of the hotel, the defendant was gone, so she started walking down Airline Highway. Soon after, the defendant reappeared and asked where she was going. The defendant asked her if she wanted to get in the car. Once inside the car, the defendant asked Miss Richmond if she got the money. Richmond testified that when she offered the defendant some of the money, he grabbed her throat and said, "That ain't enough, bitch." The defendant then pulled over to the side of the road and took all of her money. During the struggle, Richmond testified that she passed out or was knocked out. And she testified that when she regained consciousness, she was being forced out of the car by the spillway. She landed face down in a mud puddle and pretended to be dead. Richmond also testified that she had an encounter with the defendant 5 or 6 years later. She stated that she went with the defendant a second time because she believed the defendant was having a bad drug experience during the first incident. In the second incident, Richmond testified that she and the defendant were doing intravenous drugs together and that she had an overdose. During the overdose, she claims the defendant grabbed her by the neck, threw her against the wall, and injured her head. Richmond testified that she went to the hospital following the incident, but cannot remember what alias she used at the time. While at the hospital, she made out a police report, but because of her condition in the wake of the overdose, she cannot remember what she told the police or if she implicated the defendant at that time. Janie Stokes, a former prostitute, testified that she met the defendant in either 1992 or 1993 at Snell's gas station in Marrero, Louisiana. She recalled seeing the defendant sitting in his cab on previous occasions. One day, she went over to the defendant's cab and told him she needed a ride. The defendant reportedly bought her something to eat and seemed to Mrs. Stokes to be a pretty good guy. In time, the defendant introduced himself as Russell Elwood. Stokes testified that the defendant bought her some cocaine, and they went to Algiers, where she lived. They parked off of Berman Highway near Berman Park. Stokes said that she smoked the cocaine and testified, "Before I knew it, he bust my mouth wide open and started beating down and beating down." She also stated that she was naked as she escaped the car and began running down the street, although she does not remember if the defendant removed her clothes or if she did it willingly. She ran down the street until she came to a car with a driver in it, and at that point, she stated that the defendant just pulled off. Mrs. Stokes stated that she did not report the incident to the police because she was a drug addict. Antoinette Rainey testified that she became so afraid the first time she selected a photograph of the defendant from a photo lineup that she had to terminate the interview. She testified she had seen the defendant in her neighborhood and sold him rocks 4 or 5 times. On the last occasion, she saw the defendant. Rainey testified she had trouble with him. Rainey was selling drugs in Jefferson Parish near Airline Highway. The defendant tracked her down and asked her if she had anything to sell. Rainey testified that she sold the defendant 6 rocks for $100. The two started driving around. The defendant reportedly gave 2 of the rocks back to Rainey and told her to do a hit while he was driving. Rainey said at that time, the defendant hauled off and hit me. The defendant reportedly told her to do another hit of cocaine. Rainey testified that the defendant told her, "You know what I do to bitches like you? I kill them." Rainey testified that the defendant drove them under an overpass near a warehouse where he ordered her to continue to use more cocaine. Rainey testified that the defendant forced her to perform sexual acts with him. Rainey further testified that the defendant beat her while they were having sex. Rainey stated she escaped when a truck entered the area. This incident was never reported to the police. Ronald R. Camden had been a 27-and-a-half-year veteran of the Cincinnati Police Department Homicide Squad at the time of his testimony at this trial. In the late 1980s, Camden met the defendant during a case in which the defendant was not a suspect. From the late 80s through 1996, the defendant would always stop and see Camden whenever he was in town. Camden also provided the defendant with financial assistance intermittently over the years. In either July, August, or September of 1997, Camden received a phone call from the defendant who indicated to him that he was possibly being investigated in reference to some homicides in New Orleans. On November 7, 1997, Camden received another phone call from the defendant who asked if he would speak to Lieutenant Rushing, the head of the task force investigating him. On November the 10th of 1997, Camden received a phone call from Lieutenant Rushing who requested that he be present at an interview with the defendant in Canton, Ohio. Camden agreed. Camden testified that he was not going to be present as a police officer, but as Elwood's friend. On the first day of the interview, Camden confronted the defendant with a transcribed statement from Stan Hill, the inmate previously incarcerated with the defendant. The defendant denied having made a statement to Hill, and Camden suspected that the defendant was lying in this regard. Ultimately, Stan Hill's transcribed testimony was read to the defendant, and Camden testified that the defendant's response to Hill's transcribed testimony was, "Well, he really nailed me." An audio tape of Stan Hill's testimony was also played for the defendant. Camden testified that in response to different points of Hill's statement, the defendant said, "Yep, yes, right." The defendant finally admitted to Camden in a taped statement that he had indeed made the statement to Stan Hill. After the defendant admitted making the statement to Stan Hill, Camden asked the defendant for details regarding some of the incidents that were described in the statement. And Camden testified that at this point there was a dispute between the defendant and Lieutenant Sue Rushing over whether the defendant could return to Louisiana. Camden said the defendant had agreed to give her 2 cases in 3161, which refers to a stretch of road where the murdered bodies had been found, but that Rushing had told the defendant that that was not enough. The defendant insisted that they contact Walter Gorman, the colonel at the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, who had first conducted the interviews with the defendant. Gorman testified at trial that on November 25, 1997, he received a phone call from Lieutenant Rushing, who was interviewing the defendant in Ohio. The defendant had indicated to him that he wished to return to Louisiana. Gorman told him that this would not be possible unless the defendant reduced his statements to writing. The defendant told Gorman, "I'm going to give you 2, but just let me come back to New Orleans." Camden testified that at the conclusion of the phone call with Gorman, the defendant slammed down the phone and spouted derogatory terms about Gorman. Camden testified that following the phone call, that the defendant continually got out of control for a few minutes. The defendant made the following statement: Okay, I'm willing to give you this. I took a black female, I put her in my car, I took her down the road, and I put her in the water. That's all I'm going to give you. According to Camden's testimony, the defendant repeatedly asked to be returned to Louisiana for psychiatric help or to see his lawyer. Camden testified that the defendant was asked to put the statement on tape or to give a written statement regarding what he had told Camden and Rushing about putting a body in the water, but he refused. Instead, the defendant insisted that he be returned to Louisiana before he would discuss the murders. The first interview lasted approximately 14 hours, from 1 in the afternoon until 3 in the morning. The defendant made a taped statement at the interview in which he indicated he was being treated fairly. Camden testified during the interview there were periods of 10 to 15-minute breaks. The next day, Camden asked the defendant if he had given any thought to telling him and Lieutenant Rushing about the incident he had described the night before, but the defendant denied making any statements. Camden then testified he reminded the defendant that he admitted that the police stopped him in the area where the body was found, that he was associated with the victim, and he gave a statement to Stan Hill. Camden further reminded the defendant that he told Camden that he took a black female down the road in a car and put her in the water. Again, the defendant denied making such statements. Sergeant Olga Farreau of the St. Charles Parish Office, assigned to the task force at the time the defendant was interviewed in Canton, Ohio, was present for the interviews. She testified that during breaks from the interviews with the defendant, she would bring coffee or cigarettes in for him. During one such break, Sergeant Farreau testified that the defendant told her, "I'm going back to Louisiana for the 2 overdose cases. I had a black prostitute in the car, and I IV'd her. I can't incriminate myself any more than I already have." In January of 1998, the defendant voluntarily returned to Louisiana from Ohio. He was pulled over for a speeding ticket. Because of outstanding contempt of court charges resulting from the defendant's prior failure to appear for traffic tickets, he was taken into custody. Subsequently, he was arrested for the 2 murders which he was originally charged in this matter. The defendant testified at trial that he was in New Orleans from between January 31st, 1993 and February 9th, 1993. When questioned about the incident described by Deputies Fricky and Chason, the defendant asserted he was parked on the side of the road to change his oil. He claimed that the deputies failed to locate 6 quarts of motor oil located in the deck lid of his trunk. At trial, without specifically referring to each witness individually, the defendant made a general statement in which he denied knowing any of the female witnesses who had testified against them. The defendant testified he had dated prostitutes while he drove a cab, but he had never beaten any of them up. When questioned about the interview with task force members in Florida, the defendant stated that he was not surprised because he'd received a phone call from a former employer 2 weeks prior to the visit, informing him that the police were out there asking questions about him. When asked about the second interview that was conducted by the task force, the defendant stated that during the interview he informed Ron Camden and Sue Rushing he would like to talk to his attorney, Ross Scasia. The defendant also testified regarding the second interview that I said almost anything in an attempt to return to New Orleans to be in the presence of my attorney. With respect to his request of Lieutenant Rushing that he return to Louisiana, the defendant offered his tape statement that such a return would be to prove my innocence. The defendant also offered a portion of his tape statement in which he told Lieutenant Rushing, I have complete faith in you and that you will find the killers or the people that are guilty of these crimes and that I can be of assistance to you in this investigation. The defendant testified at trial that while incarcerated in Florida, he explained to other inmates he was a suspect in numerous homicides in the New Orleans area, but denied confessing to any of the inmate witnesses that he was the killer. To convict the defendant of second-degree murder, the jury would have to find that the defendant killed Cheryl Lewis when he had specific intent to kill or inflict great bodily harm. So that's the appeal that I just pulled from here. And the way that this wraps up is they sort of go over everything from a statutory perspective. As far as the appellate court is concerned, they affirm it and they remand it with an order.
Mm-hmm.
So basically what they're saying is they feel like the record reflects that everything around this case is pretty much on the up and up. The members of the jury concluded that based on what they had seen, that the defendant had been, in a position to have the means, motive, and opportunity to, beyond a reasonable doubt, to have killed Cheryl Lewis, and that they felt like he had confessed. And
so in the appeals process, in this particular case, what they were asking for, when they do that, you kind of have to split your thinking.
Right.
Because they don't have to lend credibility to his confession. They don't have to decide and they being the appeals court, they don't have to decide if he was truly confessing or if his confession made sense. They just add up the circumstances and make sure there's enough there to put together a prima facie case against somebody for a particular crime.
Right. And the circumstantial evidence existed to fulfill the standard of excluding every reasonable hypothesis of innocence, which is how they arrive at, guilt. By ruling out beyond a reasonable doubt innocence, you rule in guilt. There was one thing that they found to be an error. It's basically a technical thing, and that's the prescriptive period for appeal was marked in there as a plain error. Basically,
the judge told him it was 3 years, but they had changed and it was 2 years, and they required it to be filed with the court that they had corrected that error.
Right. So they basically they're sending it back.
I had to read that several times because it was really confusing.
Yeah. So when you read it, it looks like they found something. They really don't. They affirm it.
That's the remand. That's the only remand. It's just that they be notified that was corrected, because that actually would, while it doesn't change anything about the facts of the case or anything else, the fact that the court told the defendant the wrong amount of time, could affect their rights. And so that's the only reason it's remanded.
Right. And when you go back through this, they put footnotes on these. I love the footnotes. Do you ever read those? on these appellate documents?
I read everything.
So the footnotes on this are interesting. Mrs. Sanders, who is one of the witnesses above, she was serving a 5-year sentence at the time of her testimony for distribution of cocaine. At the trial, she testified she was not offered anything from the state in return for her testimony, nor did she expect anything in return. That's a standard thing that you hear in all of these type footnotes. So I'm not going to read that over and over. Just know that every single one of these says that that they haven't been offered anything by the state in return for testimony, nor do they expect anything in return, which is, I hate to say it this way, but that's largely bullshit. And they're always expecting something. They're always expecting to get something once these.
It just says from the state.
So Mrs. Holmes, she was serving a 25-year sentence for distribution of cocaine. She admitted to being a former prostitute. She did not hesitate in making a photographic identification of the defendant. That's her footnote. Mrs. Henry was serving a year sentence at the time of her testimony for a crime against nature. Testifying there that she wasn't getting anything. Mr. Stewart was serving a sentence for burglary and grand theft. Mr. Ray was serving time for a forged check. Mr. Hill had a 3-year sentence he was dealing with related to stolen property. Hill did testify, however. He initially hoped that if he cooperated with authorities, he might get a break on his charges. But I think by the time all of this had lapsed, his sentence was basically over. Boussier was on probation at the time of his testimony for arson in the first degree and burglary of an unoccupied dwelling. Miss Gilliam was serving a 13-year sentence for carjacking. Miss Richmond had a 10-year sentence at the time for crimes against nature. Miss Stokes had a 2.5-year sentence for crimes against nature. And Miss Rainey was serving a 5-year sentence for possession of cocaine. So this is pretty typical, and I bring it up because that you see that a lot with witnesses in cases like this. It's not that you believe them or don't believe them. It's just that that can weigh a little bit on the credibility of the witness. So which
is really funny considering, you are the company you keep.
That's very true, and there's a lot of drug use going on here. One of the things I noticed in here was, did you see they mentioned that he admitted to using LSD? That lined up with the collar, but none of the rest of this lines up with the collar at all.
Nothing.
Confirms your theory that he was locked up. The written opinion confirms he was taken into custody August the 4th, and he was in custody for 85 days. So he could not have made the call. Unless it was, there is a thing called third-party calling that used to go on back then. And that was where a person calls someone and then is able to make a call out. What's interesting about that is, because of where he was incarcerated, that would have been limited to about the time that he was on the phone. I'm still looking for his voice in the midst of all of this to try and find out.
I was going to say, you think this guy could make a third-party call?
Yeah, that's a very real thing. I dealt with.
I understand that that's a real thing. I'm saying, you think this guy could do it?
Yes, yeah, he made other third-party calls. So yeah,
what did he make another third-party call to?
To a news station. It happened after he was sentenced, but it did happen. I'm just trying to figure out if it would have been the case here. I don't think it would have, because generally the way that third-party calls work is someone has to pay for those, and you have to have. So a lot of third-party calls are for weird things, like to get a hold of a lawyer, to get a hold of a person that's going to pick you up at jail, to get a hold of a bondsman.
Is there a record that there's a third-party call?
No, they don't keep records of those. So here's how that works. Say I were incarcerated near you. I call, you collect, and you answer, although it's the age of cell phones. I don't know how anybody does that anymore. You answer the phone, and then what you would have done is you flash it over and add a call to the phone, and you can still do this in the 90s with call waiting. You dial another number, so it looks like I called you,
Well, that's
But
what
then
I'm
I
saying.
talked to
There
the
would be
person on
a
the third party
record of
part.
him using the phone, though, right?
I don't know that anybody would have. Yeah, there would be a record of him making the first call, but it wouldn't say he called
Doesn't
Howard Stern.
seem like it would be a huge leap to figure this out, even if he did do a third-party call, which I'm not so sure that he would have been able to.
One of the things that he did in 2001 references them trying to figure out a call he had made in like 1999 from like related to the jail stuff. My point to you is I can't tell if he did or not, but they would have a recording of it. So they would have his confession. So what I'm saying is nobody was listening to it if he did that in terms of a third-party call from the Highland County Jail. Ultimately, where I land with that is that rules out, because we've already ruled out Gant, but I think it rules out Elwood because people weren't smuggling cell phones in. They would have recorded that call, and I have to believe it would show up in the testimony somewhere that he had made that call.
If the FBI asked for a recording of the call, right? I believe that one of the very first things they would have done was to see who might be on the radar for any of those murders and to, in turn, check out what they were doing. Because the call would have been like very close to the time that he was in custody. Like they would have been aware that he was in custody.
Okay.
They were looking at him for the murder, even though he was just in custody for something else. Remember, they went to talk to him. And then like when he left, he bought drugs from an undercover cop. Yeah. And so he was put in jail and he had violated his probation or whatever. And so he was already on the radar because of the incident. They actually said it in the appeals opinion. They said that they hadn't, the police officers that come upon him close to the scene where Cheryl was found, they didn't do like a full incident report. They filled out an interview card. And it was just like in passing that it was mentioned. And so because that occurred.
You're talking about, so that was, just to be clear, that was a year after Cheryl Lewis's, there's a thing that you can read between the lines there.
Well, what do you mean? What are we reading between the lines?
Okay, what they're saying without saying, because they don't have proof of it, they're saying that Russell Elwood and his cab pulled off the road a mile away from one of these body discoveries because
it was Cheryl's.
There are more of them over there, but Cheryl's is the one that they're referencing as being a mile away, and that's the trial that they're in. The reference is that he is sitting in the back seat of his cab masturbating. They're not saying that, but, but he comes out with no clothes on. He's either living in his cab or he's fantasizing about whatever he did there.
A mile away? Like, that's so random.
I don't think it fits. The other thing I was going to ask you about was there's a lot of references in this appellant document that I read from where they're basically giving descriptions of him from the perspective of workers for hire being punched and throttled by this guy. There's multiple sex workers who testify in here. It's not that I don't want to believe them. It's just that I had trouble putting all of this together.
It's pretty extreme, I would say.
Like if I took the
volume of it.
Yeah, if I took the prosecutor's perspective on this, I'd be like, oh, smoking gun. I'd love all of it.
I don't know. I think it's sort of like overkill.
Well, from the perspective of a defense, like if you put on the defense attorney hat for this, it looks very
bad.
Yeah, it's like it looks like it's insurmountable.
I get what you're saying, and you're right as far as the recount and the appellate documents, but it smells weird.
It does. That's sort of what I'm getting at. It seems like it feels like a very carefully built. It feels like a very carefully built case.
Convenient that there are that many witnesses against him.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you think about it, it's almost like it would be really hard. It's almost like, okay, yeah, if one person has seen something that is relevant, that's something great for a case. But how many witnesses were there? And I'm not saying they were witnesses to the crime. It's just they all conveniently saw basically the same behavior from him over and over again. And it was all very terrible behavior.
But, I mean, and they have completely valid reasons for not having wanted to get involved in this, right? Like, they all basically said they didn't want to be called out on any of their other.
I just want to point out that, they mentioned that they were promised nothing from the state in return, right?
Yeah, which is usually
so
bullshit.
None of their sentences were reduced, right?
Right.
I don't necessarily know that includes
the other guy that set him up with the prostitutes, because he was the one who went and found those prostitutes. Is that where you're going with this?
No, I don't know that includes, well, if you didn't see that stuff and you don't testify, there may be some more charges coming your way.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying more on the side of
And so while they didn't get anything in exchange, it's that negative space again, where they also didn't get some more trumped up charges. So what I'm saying is sometimes I feel like, and this happens a lot, especially in these rampant cases of just drugs and violence. And it's all I don't want to say petty, because anytime there's violence, it's bad. But it's just people not getting along, basically, is what they're talking about. And, it's racism and sexism and all kinds of stuff happening. But in these types of cases where you have these sort of repeat offenders that just sort of they get cycled through the system constantly because of small crimes that they're committing, I think that it's they could just as easily be intimidated into testifying as they could be enticed, sure. And so, because I guarantee you, well, I don't guarantee it, but I imagine that they've constantly got something hanging over them that the police could use against them.
Oh, I'm sure.
And so to me, it's more yeah, you're going to make this case for us, or, I'm going to, but I'm going to find some drugs on your person, or I'm going to remember all the guys that you've, had over at the no-tell motel, or whatever, whatever they're keeping from them. And so that, in my opinion, when I was reading it, that's what I was thinking. I was just, it's not even very carefully worded, but if you look at the wording, basically it was no deals were made here, but threatening to charge someone if they don't testify, that's not really a deal. Because there's not a charge pending. It's dirty and it's wrong and it's not ethical, right? But that doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Well, so my next first step is to figure out exactly where Russell Elwood is right now. I think he should be in Angola. So
what was your opinion after reading all of the... so he was... Essentially what happened was he had 2 murder charges, and...
They dropped one.
And they dropped one for lack of evidence, and he was convicted of the other one, and he was sentenced to life in prison, hard labor.
At Angola, yeah.
With no possibility of anything. So he's going to be there forever. So wherever hard labor in Louisiana is, it should be there. Now, so they had him for 2 murders that they felt were connected until they realized that he had a pretty strong alibi for the one that was dropped.
Right.
Okay, so how is it that they were so connected before, but then they were severed so easily?
I I do not know what is going on there. So here's the thing about this case. All right, most of my stuff in Louisiana that I've dealt with has been obvious. Like when it's bad, like when it's bad prosecution or bad witnesses or bad cops or whatever, it's usually pretty obvious. This one is not obvious like that. This is not one of those cases I can look at and go, oh yeah, it's definitely bad cops. Because if all this information piled up and I was working a case like these guys are working these cases, I would think to myself, like, this guy did it. The problem is, like, if you take each individual piece and just see what holds up and what doesn't, the bulk of it does not hold up.
I agree. I feel like if he hadn't have been in his cab that day, that would be very unlikely that he would have ever been on the radar for any of this stuff.
I think that's the hardest part to swallow here is that this guy ends up.
I think that should be the beginning of the story. Like that he was literally only brought. It just needs to be something that is instilled in this saga here is that the reason that. So, because I don't know how you absorb this stuff, but you start being bombarded, right? And you realize like, oh, this is a serial killer. And then you step back for a second. And then the first thing I noticed about Russell Elwood was that the only reason he was a murderer, essentially, is because he was probably sleeping in his cab and a couple of off-duty police officers thought it was weird, and then they got him out of the vehicle. They searched his vehicle. He said some stupid stuff that he was, changing the oil or whatever, and he didn't have the supplies. I don't necessarily think that somebody sleeping in their vehicle on the side of the road and then like trying to say something stupid to like throw off the cops so they leave them alone. I don't know that it's a big jump to murder in my opinion. And it just seems to me like it's like the opposite of kismet, like when all hell breaks loose basically. And so if he had not been sleeping there that night and those cops hadn't gone by and made that interview card, he would have never had any association with this case at all, ever.
The problem is he starts confessing basically in various forms.
He's that kind of this guy didn't have a whole lot going for him in life at all. And I feel like he was probably really scared. Although I'm not entirely sure why, because he was in and out of jail a lot. But I think that like the murder charge to him was, even though he didn't, I don't think that I think at the very most, let's say that all of the witnesses were telling partial truths. I think at the very most that he shot up with Cheryl and then she fell into the water.
I don't know that I'm there with you. Like I just don't
think that happened. Honestly,
I don't think he's like a serial killer. But like, there's got to be something to him talking to Camden, the guy up in Ohio, and like wanting to give them a couple of cases. I think
he wanted to get out of there. I think he was probably being bothered in that jail, and he knew if he could get back to Louisiana, it'd be better.
Well, he wanted to come back down to Louisiana because there was a lawyer there that was willing to defend him. So that's the main reason.
I'm just saying people do weird things for a lot of reasons. And when I hear this guy, like sort of his reasoning for the different things that he did, it's not surprising to me that he was talking and making these big confessions, and like it's almost like he's puffing himself up. That's sort of how I saw like as I was reading the accounts of him, like the different things that happened and people testifying about things that he had said. It made me think that he was just in like this super defense mode. And I don't I'm not saying that they did anything intentionally. I'm also not saying that, but I'm not casting any blame here. But I am fairly certain he would have had some access to some information that would have, lent credibility to a confession.
I don't think we're going to find that he killed a bunch of people, but I think he might have been present for a couple of deaths.
Well, maybe.
I mean, his self confession that he was with 100 prostitutes. That's a lot. That's a
It
big
also
deal.
didn't happen.
What do you mean?
I don't think that that's an accurate statement.
You don't think he did drugs and had sex with prostitutes?
I'm not saying he didn't do that. I'm just saying I think he may have been exaggerating.
Oh, I think he was just pulling a number out of the air, going, "Well, I'm 50, and if I saw 20 a year, I think it was probably convict math, but at the same time,
well, if he had been with 100 prostitutes, how did he only kill whatever number it was?
That's a great question.
It doesn't add up, right?
Yeah, there's other parts of it that don't add up.
Nothing about this adds up at all. Honestly, I am interested in this, and I've been we've gone back and forth with Keys about the prostitute murders, and then just sort of by default. And when I say prostitute murder, I'm talking about the way they're referred to. I'm not calling them prostitute murders, but law enforcement just kind of throws their hands up in the air and says, "Oh, it's prostitute murder." But I actually feel like those are some of the best cases for us to look at because we may be their only hope.
I don't think a lot of people are looking at these, and like I said, we're going back to the victims on this. Gather as much information about these victims and other people that were missing or unidentified from this time period, looking at 1991 to 1996 ish to start. But so you asked what is my gut on this, and I'll end the episode with what I'm feeling. I can't completely rule this guy out for a couple of the overdose people got left places. I don't see him as a killer. I don't see him as killing them on purpose.
Right.
But
so you would agree that leaving after someone overdosed is not a serial killer make.
Yeah, I totally agree. That I'm not. I don't think this guy's a serial killer like that. And I do think he distracted the departments involved in the serial crime task force enough that he made a mess down there. And here's the weird part: I actually think Gant could have been involved in some of the other deaths. And then I think but as far as if this Clay guy is legit, if the caller's legit, here's the crazy part: I don't think anybody caught him.
No, Clay has not been caught.
And that's really weird.
It's horrifying. And I think that part of the mechanism to sort of deal with that is to say, oh, it had to have been Russell Elwood, because there's no way that a killer that had killed that many people at that point in time would have, continued to be free. What I'm wondering is if I can get far enough into this case to connect the different groups of people, if it's the same person.
That would be interesting to me if Clay was still killing. So that's where we're headed with this, is to see if we can figure out who he is.
Is there someone else that's been convicted of killing multiple prostitutes in that area?
Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabRottiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabRottiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
And I guess we'll kind of end on some sad news out of Iowa. It's not been confirmed yet, but a farmer found the body of an adolescent outside of Montezuma, Iowa, who's unfortunately, the clothing appears to match Xavier Harrelson. It's a kid that went missing early in the summer that we got pretty heavily invested in, had a lot of questions about, but it appears that he may have been found, and they may be confirming that any day now. That's really sad news to hear. So thoughts and prayers with the people who cared about him, and they haven't said what's going on with it. He was found in a combine field, but by a farmer. It's sort of that time of year where hunters and farmers out for harvest are, they're going to come across remains. Hope that kid gets some justice if it's something that needs justice, and I hope he gets to rest in some peace now.
Take a chance and wait, stay light as a feather, shake away the weight, cut what makes you tethered. Trust when you fall in every risk you take, knowing redemption's always on its way. Let all the courage in you start to wake. Unafraid, 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 I'm unafraid. Every second I'm raising up higher. Unafraid, I'm unafraid. Don't count the mistakes, look for better measures. Keep hope in your gaze, hold truth as a treasure. Trust when you fall in every risk you take, knowing redemption's always on its way. Let all the courage in you start to wake. Unafraid, unafraid, unafraid.